All right, and that's a pretty good time to introduce our next guest, actually. Dr. Gavin Ellis. Now, I remember Gavin Ellis because he was, and so will you, the former editor, and in actual fact, the former editor-in-chief, I'll come to that, of the New Zealand Herald. He's got an extensive background in journalism and communications, and that's the point about that editor-in-chief. It didn't just cover the editorial roles, like what's in the paper, but the management roles as well. And his editorship of the Herald was significant. So significant that I think they gave him an Order of Merit in the Queen's Birthday Honours List in 2015 for services to journalism. He subsequently did a PhD in political studies. He's become a media and a media consultant and commentator. He's a member, an honorary fellow of the Koitu Centre for Informed Futures, which is, I think, Peter Gluckman's think tank. And we've had him on the show before, and he joins us now. Peter, lovely to have you on again. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good morning, Michael. Good to be here.
Just before I carry on, I didn't realise you're an honorary fellow of the Koitu Centre for Informed Futures. That is Peter Gluckman's think tank, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It is. I and a number of my colleagues have done a number of projects there. Last year we did one, you may remember, if not journalists, then who? We looked at what happens if we no longer have sufficient journalists to do the nitty-gritty stuff. This year we've followed that up with another one, which I think we're going to talk about today, looking at what happens if we don't have the means to cover local news.
Yeah, okay. And that's what we do want to talk to you about today. You've written the most recent report released this month called News Deserts, Local Journalism at Risk. And essentially it's an argument that in New Zealand there will be, if there are not already, deserts. In other words, you will not be able to get any information about what's happening locally because journalists do not exist there. Over the past 7 years, you say 40 community newspapers have closed, and that means you consider that there is going to be a significant effect, particularly upon local democracy in this country. Very relevant given the fact we're just about to elect councils all over the country. What do you perceive as the major reasons why these news deserts have been created? And do you think it's going to get worse rather than before it gets better?
Yeah, I mean, there's no single reason why these papers have folded. The group-owned ones, the ones owned by Stuff and NZME, seem to be the most vulnerable because they also share the group overheads and so on. Smaller local outlets, maybe owned by a husband and wife team that have been battling away for years and just make enough to make a living, seem to have survived a bit better, but even they're vulnerable. There are all sorts of reasons. I mean, one of the reasons is the cost of distribution.
Yeah.
Rural delivery and NZ Post charges go up every year, and the ability of these small enterprises to cover those sort of costs is diminishing by the day. Now, this is not just a New Zealand problem. News deserts are a problem in many, many countries. 55 million Americans live in areas where there is no news gathering and distribution or very little. So it's not just a problem we're facing, but it is going to get worse, I think, before it gets better, because it's just becoming harder and harder for even small operations to sustain what they're doing. Now, of course, there are exceptions. I mean, in Auckland here, in East Auckland, there's the Eastern Times, and they're doing well. I mean, every fortnight they put out 72 pages. That's serving Howick, Pakuranga, around that area. Where I live, in Lindfield, there is nothing. The local government elections are on, and yet I've seen nothing that interrogates the local candidates, particularly local board candidates. I'm not talking about the mayoral race here. I'm talking about everybody else. We get nothing of that. Now, you must have experienced that down where you are in some of the areas that you cover in your local body role, it's hard to get to the communities involved because there aren't the outlets there. I think probably you're a bit better served than some areas up north, actually.
Well, that's probably true. But I mean, it's mostly is it mostly provincial and rural New Zealand? Because I'm assuming that the larger provincial cities, the Napiers, the Timaroos, the Wanganuis, the New Plymouths are okay, but we're talking about smaller towns than say 20,000 who are missing out on this sort. Or are you saying for example, you've just talked about community newspapers. Are you saying that it's larger areas where there are strong concentrations of population, which the New Zealand Herald, for example, the Christchurch Press doesn't cover, or both?
All of the above, all
Mm,
of the above, everything
yeah.
from the small rural settlements right through to, as I say, where I live in Auckland, smack in the middle of Auckland. I don't have any local news coverage. The Herald doesn't drill down that far, and in fact, no, none of these metropolitan papers really do. Although I have to say that, the press and the Post seem to have done a good job in having these town hall meetings of candidates, sponsoring uh, good old fashioned get them in the one room together meetings, which I think is a great idea. Um, but it's not the same thing as telling me about who I should vote for my local board. But I think that probably um, rural communities will feel it most because, there are other means um, in Auckland, for example, where you can still get aspects of community communication. But when a small settlement loses the local paper that's been there since your grandfather was, um, that really has an effect. And the sort of effect that it has is disengagement. Looking at some of the studies that um, I reviewed for this paper that we've just published, in Australia, for example, Lightning Ridge, mining settlement, used to have a thriving little paper, went out of business. Now they're finding that not only is there a sense of a lack of community, but engagement in local politics is diminishing. The voting has gone down. Um, Engagement with local politicians has gone down, and so on. So, these are not just nice to haves. These are part of the glue that hold our communities together. You know, whether it's
Can I just take down?
keeping you on your toes, or
Well,
telling me about the kids at the local tennis club.
yeah, I would have thought that the latter is possibly the more important in actual fact, explaining to people in communities what's going on in their community, and that's not necessarily having a political bent. That's just simply an information suite. Do you think one
Yep.
of the problems is that um, advertisers have moved away because that's not where the people are? So, I mean, the reason that newspapers slow down is because they can't get the advertising either. They can't get the income to support themselves. But that's because there are other, and frankly, from the point of view of advertisers, better opportunities to spend their money to get to the people they want to get to.
Well, I think certainly the perception, and we know that advertising is dropping. But my brother lives in a rural community, and they fall on their local rag when it comes out. I think it might be a monthly one. At the back of it, there are pages and pages of local services. Now that's where he goes to find his electrician, to find where he gets his winter wood supply, and so on. If you asked him to do it on the internet, he'd say, "What?" So I think that there's maybe a little bit of difference between perception and reality, that people are being moved into digital environments because they think that's where they should be, but the users of their services may actually find that they get better value out of sticking with the old tried and true because that's where people go to look for them.
A lot of newspapers, though, have moved to a full, and it's almost inevitable that they won't print, literally won't print anymore, and they won't need to distribute, which is a significant cost component, and will
Yep.
move online for everything. The problem with that is what, Gavin?